The rain hit the courthouse steps like 1,000 whispered accusations. Reporters clustered beneath umbrellas, flashes igniting the gray morning as the double doors creaked open. And there he was, Ethan Cole. Once a decorated Delta Force commander, now a man with wrists chained and eyes that burned like a wounded lion's. Inside, whispers followed him like shadows. That's him. The veteran who stole from the Helion Foundation. The one who assaulted the billionaire's son. But those who truly knew Ethan, men who had fought beside him in the blackest corners of the world, knew he wasn't capable of the crimes he'd been accused of. Still, justice in the city of gold didn't bend toward the broken, it bowed to power. And power had a name, Damien Core. Billionaire philanthropist, CEO of Helion Industries. And the man who had just destroyed Ethan's life. The courtroom was a theater of control. Damien sat at the front, his tailored navy suit immaculate, silver watch gleaming under the lights. He exuded the calm confidence of a man who had never been told, no. His eyes flicked briefly to Ethan. A faint smile, almost sympathetic, but with venom hiding beneath. Ethan's public defender whispered, don't react. They're watching. Ethan didn't move. He had trained his body for discipline, but inside, his mind churned like a battlefield. He had been through hell. Afghanistan, Syria, classified missions even the Pentagon denied existed. Yet none of it compared to this. None of it compared to watching his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, sitting in the back row clutching a worn teddy bear, her face pale and confused. He'd promised her once, years ago, Daddy will always come home. Now, he couldn't even promise he'd walk out of this courtroom free. The prosecutor rose. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Ethan Cole used his military expertise to hack and embezzle funds from the Helion Foundation, funneling them into offshore accounts. When confronted, he physically assaulted Mr. Core's son, leaving him hospitalized. The words were a knife twisting in the wound. Lies, every one of them. Ethan's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening against the table. Damien's son, Nathan Core, sat nearby, face bandaged, head lowered. But something flickered in the boy's eyes when Ethan looked at him. Guilt, regret. The kid couldn't meet his gaze. The judge adjusted her glasses. Mr. Cole, how do you plead? Ethan stood slowly. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of storms. Not guilty, Your Honor, I didn't steal anything. And I never laid a hand on that boy. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Damien's smile didn't fade. Later that night, in the dim light of his holding cell, Ethan stared at the cracked ceiling. Mind replaying every moment that led to this nightmare. He'd met Damien 2 years ago when he was struggling to find steady work after leaving the military. The billionaire had offered him a job, security chief for the Helion Foundation's humanitarian division. It had felt like redemption, purpose, stability for Lily. But slowly, Ethan began noticing things. Shipments marked as medical supplies going to places they shouldn't, encrypted emails between Damien's executives and defense contractors. He'd confronted Damien once. That was his first mistake. Now, Damien had turned the full force of his empire against him. A guard unlocked the cell door. You got a visitor. Ethan frowned. It wasn't visiting hours. When the door opened, a familiar face stepped through. Grace Turner, an investigative journalist known for digging up stories powerful men wanted buried. Ethan, she said quietly, stepping close. I believe you. He looked at her, exhausted. You're the only one. She placed a small recorder on the table. You were framed. I've been following Damien Core for months. Offshore accounts, bribed officials, missing aid money. It's all connected. But I need proof, something from the inside. Something only you would know. Ethan's pulse quickened. There was a drive, he whispered. Encrypted. I hid it the night before they came for me. Grace leaned in. Where? Before he could answer, the guard cleared his throat. Time's up. She stood, eyes locking with his. Hold on, Ethan. I'm going to find it. That night, as the cell lights dimmed, Ethan's mind raced. Hope was dangerous, but it was also the only weapon he had left. Across town, in a penthouse that looked down upon the city like a god's throne, Damien Core poured himself a drink. The news played in the background. Decorated veteran faces trial in embezzlement scandal. His reflection smiled back at him in the window. His assistant entered. Everything's in motion, sir. The media's running with your version. Damien nodded. Good. By the time the truth surfaces, he'll be too broken for anyone to care. But deep down, behind his perfectly polished facade, a seed of unease began to stir. Because he knew one thing about men like Ethan Cole. Delta Force didn't break easily. And if Ethan ever got out, Damien Core would learn that some wars don't end on the battlefield. The rain hit the courthouse steps like 1,000 whispered accusations. Reporters clustered beneath umbrellas, flashes igniting the gray morning as the double doors creaked open, and there he was, Ethan Cole. Once a decorated Delta Force commander, now a man with wrists chained and eyes that burned like a wounded lion's. Inside, whispers followed him like shadows. That's him. The veteran who stole from the Helion Foundation. The one who assaulted the billionaire's son. But those who truly knew Ethan, men who had fought beside him in the blackest corners of the world, knew he wasn't capable of the crimes he'd been accused of. Still, justice in the city of gold didn't bend toward the broken, it bowed to power. And power had a name, Damien Core, billionaire philanthropist, CEO of Helion Industries. And the man who had just destroyed Ethan's life. The courtroom was a theater of control. Damien sat at the front, his tailored navy suit immaculate, silver watch gleaming under the lights. He exuded the calm confidence of a man who had never been told, no. His eyes flicked briefly to Ethan. A faint smile, almost sympathetic, but with venom hiding beneath. Ethan's public defender whispered, "Don't react. They're watching." Ethan didn't move. He had trained his body for discipline, but inside, his mind churned like a battlefield. He had been through hell. Afghanistan, Syria, classified missions even the Pentagon denied existed. Yet none of it compared to this. None of it compared to watching his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, sitting in the back row clutching a worn teddy bear, her face pale and confused. He'd promised her once, years ago, "Daddy will always come home." Now, he couldn't even promise he'd walk out of this courtroom free. The prosecutor rose. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Ethan Cole used his military expertise to hack and embezzle funds from the Helion Foundation, funneling them into offshore accounts. When confronted, he physically assaulted Mr. Core's son, leaving him hospitalized. The words were a knife twisting in the wound. Lies, every one of them. Ethan's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening against the table. Damien's son, Nathan Core, sat nearby, face bandaged, head lowered. But something flickered in the boy's eyes when Ethan looked at him. Guilt, regret. The kid couldn't meet his gaze. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Cole, how do you plead?" Ethan stood slowly. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of storms. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I didn't steal anything. And I never laid a hand on that boy." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Damien's smile didn't fade. Later that night, in the dim light of his holding cell, Ethan stared at the cracked ceiling. Mind replaying every moment that led to this nightmare. He'd met Damien 2 years ago when he was struggling to find steady work after leaving the military. The billionaire had offered him a job, security chief for the Helion Foundation's humanitarian division. It had felt like redemption, purpose, stability for Lily. But slowly, Ethan began noticing things. Shipments marked as medical supplies going to places they shouldn't. Encrypted emails between Damien's executives and defense contractors. He'd confronted Damien once. That was his first mistake. Now, Damien had turned the full force of his empire against him. A guard unlocked the cell door. "You got a visitor." Ethan frowned. It wasn't visiting hours. When the door opened, a familiar face stepped through. Grace Turner, an investigative journalist known for digging up stories powerful men wanted buried. "Ethan," she said quietly, stepping close. "I believe you." He looked at her, exhausted. "You're the only one." She placed a small recorder on the table. "You were framed. I've been following Damien Core for months. Offshore accounts, bribed officials, missing aid money. It's all connected. But I need proof, something from the inside. Something only you would know." Ethan's pulse quickened. "There was a drive," he whispered. "Encrypted. I hid it the night before they came for me." Grace leaned in. "We're..." Before he could answer, the guard cleared his throat. "Time's up." She stood, eyes locking with his. "Hold on, Ethan. I'm going to find it." That night, as the cell lights dimmed, Ethan's mind raced. Hope was dangerous, but it was also the only weapon he had left. Across town, in a penthouse that looked down upon the city like a god's throne, Damien Core poured himself a drink. The news played in the background. Decorated veteran faces trial in embezzlement scandal. His reflection smiled back at him in the window. His assistant entered. "Everything's in motion, sir. The media's running with your version." Damien nodded. "Good. By the time the truth surfaces, he'll be too broken for anyone to care." But deep down, behind his perfectly polished facade, a seed of unease began to stir. Because he knew one thing about men like Ethan Cole. Delta Force didn't break easily. And if Ethan ever got out, Damien Core would learn that some wars don't end on the battlefield. The storm didn't let up for 2 days. Rain washed the city in cold silver, blurring the line between shadow and reflection. Grace Turner hadn't slept more than an hour at a time, her mind wired on caffeine and fear. The encrypted drive sat on the motel table, its tiny LD blinking like a heartbeat. She'd tried every password Ethan could have used. Service numbers, daughter's birthday, deployment coordinates. Nothing worked. Then, as she pored over her notes, she spotted something. A faded photo she'd taken of Ethan's tattoo during an old interview. A Delta Force insignia intertwined with a quote. "The only easy day was yesterday." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed the words, hit enter, and the screen flickered. Lines of code scrolled like falling rain. Then came folders, dozens of them, each named after humanitarian missions Helion Foundation had supposedly funded. But inside were transaction logs, arms deals and black site contracts. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't charity, it was war by proxy. Then she saw something that froze her completely. Video files, encrypted, but labeled with operation names she recognized from military leaks. One folder bore Ethan's name. Her hands shook as she opened it. A video feed appeared, time-stamped from 18 months ago. A dusty outpost in Eastern Europe. Ethan stood there in full tactical gear, shouting into a radio. Behind him, crates marked Helion Foundation relief supplies. But when one fell open, the camera caught what was inside: not medical supplies, but assault rifles and missiles. Grace covered her mouth. Ethan hadn't stolen anything. He had stumbled upon a weapons smuggling operation disguised as aid. And Damien Core had silenced him for it. Her phone vibrated. She ignored it, copying the files to an encrypted cloud. Then headlights flashed through the motel blinds. A black SUV pulled into the lot. They had found her. Grace grabbed her jacket, stuffed the drive into her pocket, and bolted for the back exit. Rain pelted her face as she sprinted down an alley. The SUV's doors burst open, and 2 men in tactical rain gear followed. One of them shouted, "Turner! Stop!" She ducked into an abandoned laundromat, breathing hard. The air smelled of mold and detergent. She crouched behind a row of rusted machines, gripping her phone. She texted a single message to a number Ethan had memorized long ago. The emergency contact of his former commanding officer, Colonel Samuel Reeves. Message Ethan Cole framed. Helion running weapons. Need extraction. Grace. She sent it, praying someone would see it before it was too late. Footsteps echoed through the laundromat. Slow, deliberate. "Come on, Ms. Turner," one of the men said, his voice calm. "No one wants to hurt you. Just give us the drive." She stayed silent, inching toward the back window. Then glass shattered. One of them had spotted her reflection. Bullets tore through the machines, sending sparks flying. Grace dove through the window, crashing into the mud outside. She ran until her lungs burned. By the time she reached a main road, she had lost them, but her car was gone. She flagged down a passing truck, waving desperately. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, slowed down. "You okay, miss?" "Please," she gasped. "Just drive." Meanwhile, inside the detention center, Ethan was summoned again. This time to meet an unexpected visitor. A man in his late 50s with a steely calm and the unmistakable bearing of a soldier walked in. Colonel Samuel Reeves. Ethan shot to his feet. "Sir." Reeves nodded. "At ease, soldier. I got your message." Ethan frowned. "Message?" The colonel held up his phone. "A journalist named Turner. She said you were set up. Is it true?" Ethan leaned forward. "Every damn word. Damien Core used Helion as a front for arms deals. I found proof and tried to expose it. He buried me instead." Reeves's jaw tightened. "You always did have a way of pissing off the wrong people." They shared a brief, grim smile. The colonel glanced around before lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. You don't have long. There's chatter in the intel community. Core's people are moving fast to clean house. Anyone who knows anything is in danger, including that journalist. If she's alive, she's your only shot." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "Then get me out of here." Reeves hesitated. "You're facing federal charges, son. I can't just walk you out." Ethan's voice dropped. "You taught me that loyalty doesn't end on the battlefield. If I don't stop Core, people die. Maybe thousands. You know what's at stake." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right. I'll see what I can do. But if this goes south, I've been in worse places," Ethan said quietly. Hours later, a staged prison transfer was arranged. Officially, Ethan was being moved to a higher security facility. Unofficially, it was a rescue. When the van pulled onto the highway, the two guards in front exchanged a brief glance. Then one of them tapped the side mirror twice. That was the signal. The driver veered off, rode into a dense patch of woods. The back door opened, and Colonel Reeves stood there, raincoat soaked. Move. Ethan jumped out, his shackles cut loose. Where's Grace? Last seen heading west. But she's not safe. Ethan's eyes hardened. Then I'll find her. The colonel tossed him a small pack. Inside were civilian clothes, cash, and a burner phone. You're a ghost now, Cole. You want justice, get your proof and disappear. Ethan nodded once. No sir. I don't disappear. I finished the mission. He turned toward the storm, vanishing into the dark tree line. In his penthouse, Damien Corr poured another glass of bourbon, staring at the city lights. His assistant entered nervously. Sir, there's been a breach. Ethan Cole escaped custody. Damien's glass froze halfway to his lips. Slowly a smile crept across his face. Good, let him run. A cornered man shows you where the real threats hide. But deep down, for the first time, Damien Corr felt something he hadn't in years. Fear. The highway lights blurred past like falling stars as Ethan drove the stolen pickup through the night. Every mile between him and the prison felt like a breath stolen from fate. He hadn't felt this alive, or this hunted, since his Delta Force days. The rain had eased into a mist, the kind that coated everything in silence. The kind that gave ghosts cover. He gripped the wheel tightly, replaying the colonel's words. Grace was alive, but barely. If Damien Corr's men were after her, time wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon. In the passenger seat sat the burner phone. It vibrated once. Unknown number. Ethan answered. Ethan, Grace's voice came through, weak but steady. You're out. His heart surged at the sound. Where are you? Moving. I can't stay in one place. They know I have the drive. I need you to send me a location. I can't risk it, she said. They're tracking signals. But listen. I got into the files, you were right. Helion's been smuggling weapons under the guise of humanitarian aid for years. It's all there. Transactions, routes, contracts. If we can get this to the right hands. What will? Ethan said firmly. I'm coming for you. Before Grace could reply, static hissed through the line. Then a voice, male, mocking, cutting, touching reunion. But you're both out of your depth. Damien Corr, Grace gasped. He's on the line. Ethan's grip tightened. Corr. If you lay a hand on her. You'll what? Damien interrupted smoothly. You're a fugitive, Ethan. The entire state is hunting you. And that journalist. She's an afterthought. You should have stayed where I left you. The line went dead. Ethan slammed his fist against the steering wheel. He's tracking her, he muttered. He drove until dawn. Heading west toward the mountains. Toward where Grace had last sent a signal before switching phones. He stopped at a roadside diner, pulling his hood low as he sat in a corner booth. The waitress poured him coffee without asking questions. People here knew how to mind their own business. As he sipped, he noticed two men walk in. Military haircuts, clean-shaven, trying too hard to blend in. Ethan didn't need confirmation. Corr's men. He left cash on the table, slipped out the back, and made for the forest line behind the diner. The two followed seconds later. The chase was quick, brutal, silent. Ethan moved through the trees like a predator, years of training guiding his every step. One of the men caught sight of movement. Too late. Ethan's arm snaked around his neck, silencing him before he could draw breath. The other spun, gun raised, but Ethan rolled low, grabbed a rock, and struck hard. When the forest was still again, he dragged the bodies into the underbrush, pocketed their radio, and whispered. You picked the wrong ghost to hunt. 2 hours later, Grace arrived at a safe house owned by an old contact of hers. A retired intelligence analyst named Marcus Wynn. The place was isolated, tucked behind the crumbling facade of a mountain lodge. Marcus was in his 60s, wary and sharp-eyed, with a smoker's cough and a distrust of everyone. He poured coffee and asked, You know what you've dragged into my house? Grace exhaled. The truth. And a death sentence if we fail. He stared at the laptop as she opened the drive's contents. His expression darkened with each passing file. Good God. This isn't just corruption. It's treason. Grace nodded. That's why we can't take it to the press. Not yet. We need someone who can act on it before Corr shuts it all down. Marcus rubbed his temples. Then we go higher. Someone untouchable. Ooh. He hesitated, then said, There's a senator, Rachel Holden. She's been investigating defense contracts tied to Helion. If we can reach her before Corr does, she might be able to expose this in Congress. Grace's phone buzzed again. An unknown text message. It read, "Get out now." The window shattered a second later. Bullets tore through the lodge walls. Grace screamed as Marcus dove behind the counter. "Move," he shouted. They crawled to the back exit, splinters flying. Outside, 2 SUVs blocked the driveway. Men in tactical black surrounded the house, their laser sights cutting through the fog. Marcus fired blindly toward the vehicles, covering Grace as she sprinted into the trees. She heard the gunfire fade behind her, then a scream, Marcus's scream. Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. She ran until her lungs gave out. When she finally collapsed by a riverbank, she fumbled her phone, dialing Ethan's burner number with trembling hands. He answered on the second ring. "Grace. They found me again," she gasped. "Marcus is dead. I barely made it out. Where are you?" She looked around. Mountains, river, a rusted water tower in the distance. Near Ridge Hollow, maybe 5 miles east of the old Helion airstrip. "Stay put," Ethan said. "I'm coming." By nightfall, she saw headlights approaching slowly through the trees. She raised the pistol Marcus had given her, finger trembling, until she heard a familiar voice call softly, "Grace." She lowered the gun. Ethan stepped into view, soaked, exhausted, but alive. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. Two people who had lost everything but the truth. He reached her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "You did good," he said. Grace shook her head. "They're everywhere. Cour's men. He's cleaning up loose ends. Then we hit him where he's weakest," Ethan said quietly. "Public exposure. You said something about a senator." Grace nodded. "Rachel Holden. Washington, she's our only shot." Ethan looked out toward the dark horizon. "Then we go to Washington." Far away, in a glass tower overlooking the city, Damien Cour stood before a digital map showing every move his men had made. He watched as 2 blinking dots, Ethan and Grace, merged into one signal heading northeast. He smiled coldly. "Good," he murmured. "Let them come." He turned toward a secure case on his desk, opening it to reveal a sleek black pistol and a single folder labeled Pierrot J. Stand. Inside were documents that tied him not just to Helion, but to covert operations authorized by names in government no one dared speak aloud. If Ethan and Grace reached Washington, it wouldn't just be his empire that fell. It would be the entire foundation that built it. And Damien Cour would burn the world before letting that happen. The morning sky over Ridge Hollow was pale and restless, painted with streaks of rose and ash. Ethan and Grace moved through the forest in silence, the weight of exhaustion pressing on both of them. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked soil, but beneath that peace lingered the constant awareness of pursuit. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves sent their hearts racing. Ethan had mapped the terrain in his mind, an old soldier's instinct. "There's a freight line about 3 miles east," he said quietly. "If we catch it, we can ride it north. No roads, no checkpoints." Grace nodded, clutching the drive close to her chest. "You really think we can make it to Washington?" He glanced at her. "We have to. Cour's not afraid of the law. He's afraid of daylight. We bring this into the open, and he loses the shadows he hides in." They walked until their legs trembled. As the train tracks came into view, a forgotten rail line cutting through the woods, they heard the low hum of an engine behind them. "A drone. Down," Ethan hissed. They dove under the brush as the drone swept overhead, its red sensor scanning the ground. He reached into his pack, pulling out an emergency flare. He waited for the drone to circle back, then lit it and threw it westward. The bright smoke caught its attention, and the drone veered off course. Grace exhaled shakily. "That was close." Ethan smiled faintly. "Close is better than dead." They followed the tracks until nightfall, when a slow, moving freight train rumbled through the valley. Ethan grabbed Grace's hand. Together they jumped onto one of the empty cars, collapsing against the cold metal floor. For a long moment, there was only silence, the sound of the wind rushing past and the steady rhythm of the tracks. Grace finally spoke. "You could have run, you know. Started over somewhere. Why risk everything for this?" Ethan looked out into the dark, eyes distant. "Because I've seen what happens when good people look the other way. I did things in the field I can't take back, but this is one fight I can finish the right way." Grace studied him. "And Lily," his expression softened. "Everything I do now is for her. She deserves to grow up knowing her father wasn't a monster." Hours passed. The train carried them into the outskirts of the next state. When it finally stopped near a rural depot, they slipped off and found shelter in an abandoned barn. Ethan tended a small fire, and Grace finally let herself rest, head leaning against the wall, exhaustion pulling her under. He watched her sleep for a moment. Then, quietly, he took the drive from her jacket. He wasn't stealing it. He just needed to see it for himself. Plugging it into his laptop, he scanned the files, and there it was, a folder titled PROJT. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents marked TOPCCROT, and photos, grainy surveillance shots from his own missions overseas. He saw himself and his team delivering crates under Helion's insignia. Except those crates were filled with weapons. Distributed not to allies, but to known insurgent groups. Ethan's stomach turned. My God. Core hadn't just framed him. He'd used Ethan's own missions to fund wars in exchange for power and influence. And worse, Ethan realized, some of the men he'd lost in those missions, men he'd mourned, hadn't died by enemy fire, they'd been set up to be silenced. Grace stirred awake. Ethan, what is it? He turned the screen toward her. He used us, Grace. Every op I ran under Helion's humanitarian cover, it was a lie. We weren't saving lives. We were arming killers. Grace stared at the screen, horrified. If this goes public, Ethan nodded grimly. It'll bring Core down. But it'll drag half the defense world down with him. They both sat in silence, realizing the magnitude of what they held. Before dawn, they stole a car from a nearby junkyard and drove east. Each hour brought new danger. Roadblocks, alerts on the radio, Core's men tightening the net. But the closer they got to Washington, the more determined they became. Meanwhile, inside Helion Tower, Damien Core stood before his board of directors. The atmosphere was tense. One of the men at the table, a gray-haired executive, cleared his throat. Damien, this situation is spiraling. The journalist's still alive. Cole's escaped. If that data surfaces, Core cut him off. It won't. How can you be sure? Damien smiled faintly. Because I built Helion on the understanding that fear is stronger than truth. And everyone has something to lose. He walked to the window, overlooking the city below. Prepare the cleanup team, and initiate Strand protocol. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. Strand wasn't a project, it was a fail-safe. A digital detonation that would wipe every trace of Helion's operations, along with anyone who stood too close. Back on the road, Grace's phone buzzed with a single incoming message from an unknown number. They know your destination. Trust no one in D.C. She showed it to Ethan. He didn't even blink. Then we'll find our own way in. They arrived at the outskirts of Washington 3 days later, both worn thin but alive. Grace reached out to her contact in Senator Holden's office, arranging a clandestine meeting. The senator had agreed to see them, off the record. But that night, as they waited in a safe house, Grace caught sight of a black SUV idling across the street. She froze, watching as two men stepped out, scanning the area. Ethan pulled her back from the window. They're here. How did they find us? Doesn't matter. He grabbed the bag with the drive. Why move? Now. They ran through the narrow back alleys, footsteps echoing, sirens wailing in the distance. Grace stumbled, clutching the drive, but Ethan caught her hand, pulling her forward. As they reached an intersection, headlights blinded them. Another SUV screeched to a halt in front of them. Doors flew open. Men in suits, weapons drawn. Ethan raised his hands slightly, shielding Grace. You won't get what you're after. He growled. A familiar voice answered from the shadows. You underestimate me, Commander. Damien Core stepped forward, calm as ever, his immaculate suit untouched by the chaos. He smiled like a man greeting an old friend. You and I have unfinished business. Grace's breath caught. You. Core's eyes glinted. I offered you a life, Ethan. Stability. You could have been a hero with my backing. But you chose to be a martyr. Ethan's jaw clenched. I chose to be a father who could look his daughter in the eyes. For the first time, Core's smile faltered. He gestured to his men. Take it from them. And this? But before they could move, a spotlight flashed overhead. Helicopter blades thundered. A voice shouted through a megaphone. Federal agents. Drop your weapons. Core's men froze. Grace stared upward, relief flooding her. Senator Holden. She whispered. She came through. Core's expression turned to fury. No. Ethan lunged, tackling one of Core's guards, disarming him in a blur of motion. Chaos erupted. Gunfire, shouting, flashing lights. Grace ducked behind a car, clutching the drive. And in the middle of it all, Damien Core slipped into the shadows, escaping into the maze of the city. The war wasn't over, it had just reached its final act. The city burned with sirens that night. Police cruisers, SUT vans, and black SUVs choked the streets around the safe house where the confrontation had erupted. Rain fell again, steady and relentless, as though the heavens themselves were trying to wash the blood and lies from the pavement. Ethan Cole stood against a squad car, his wrists in cuffs once more. But this time, he didn't fight it. Across the street, Grace Turner spoke urgently with Senator Rachel Holden beneath an umbrella, her face streaked with tears and exhaustion. "Everything's on this drive," Grace said, voice trembling. "Every file, every transaction. Helion's entire black network. He used charities as a front for global arms trafficking, and Ethan Cole as his scapegoat." Holden's eyes were sharp, calculating. "We'll verify it. And if it's true, we'll take it straight to the committee hearings. I promise you, this will go public." "Make sure it does," Grace whispered. She turned toward Ethan, who was now being loaded into a patrol car. He met her eyes through the rain, spattered glass, gave a small nod. The silent promise of a man who'd spent his life keeping his word. Hours later, inside a federal interrogation room, Ethan sat alone. His clothes were soaked, his knuckles scraped raw. He had expected this part, the cold room, the questions, the suspicion. But what he hadn't expected was the sudden quiet when the door opened and Senator Holden herself stepped inside. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone formal but not unkind. "You've caused quite a storm." Ethan gave a faint smile. "So I've been told." She took a seat opposite him. Agent Turner turned over the data. "We've already confirmed parts of it. It's worse than anyone imagined. Damien Core didn't just break laws, he orchestrated wars." Ethan's gaze stayed steady. "Then you know what to do." Holden nodded slowly. "I do. But you should know, this won't be simple. Core has allies in high places. People who will bury this if they can. Then don't give them the chance." Ethan said quietly. "Put it in front of the people. Let the truth do what bullets can't." Holden studied him a moment longer. "You could walk away from this. Testify, take a deal. A clean slate for you and your daughter." Ethan's eyes softened at the mention of Lily. "All I've ever wanted was to give her a reason to believe her father wasn't the villain they painted." Holden stood. "Then I suggest you testify, Commander. Not for them, for her." For 3 days later, the world stopped to listen. The U.S. Capitol brimmed with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning as Senator Holden took her seat at the head of a congressional hearing. Before her sat a row of witnesses, among them Grace Turner and Ethan Cole. Outside, thousands gathered. Veterans, families, and citizens who had followed every headline of the scandal unraveling before their eyes. The air was electric with the sense that something monumental was about to shift. Grace was called first. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied as she spoke. She described the evidence, the threats, the deaths of those who had tried to tell the truth before her. She named names. She showed footage from the drive. Then it was Ethan's turn. He rose slowly, dressed in a dark suit, posture straight, every inch the soldier he once was. The chamber fell silent. "Commander Cole," Senator Holden began, "you served this country for 17 years. Why risk your life to expose Helion and Damien Core?" Ethan looked around the room, at the senators, the press, the cameras broadcasting his words to the world. Then he spoke, his voice steady, low, but cutting through every heart in that hall. "Because I spent half my life fighting in shadows," he said. "And I learned something there. Truth doesn't die in darkness. It waits. It waits for men and women who still have the courage to drag it into the light. Damien Core built an empire on deceit, and he thought silence would protect him. But silence isn't loyalty. It's surrender. And I don't surrender." There was a murmur of approval, a wave of quiet emotion rolling through the crowd. Holden leaned forward. "And what do you want now, Mr. Cole?" Ethan paused. "Justice. Not just for me, for every soldier who bled believing they were fighting for something pure, only to learn they were weapons in another man's pocket." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Across the world, millions watched the broadcast. News outlets exploded with coverage. Within 48 hours, the Senate Intelligence Committee launched an official investigation. Arrests followed. Offshore accounts froze. Helion Industries crumbled. But Damien Core, he had vanished. 2 weeks later, in a quiet suburb outside D.C., Ethan walked through a park with Lily. The autumn air was crisp and the leaves had turned to gold. She clung to his hand, her small fingers warm against his calloused palm. "Mom says people at school were talking about you," she said softly. "They said you're a hero now." Ethan smiled faintly. "Heroes are just people who keep standing when they're too tired to run." She looked up at him, curious. Are you tired, Daddy? He laughed quietly. A little. But I'm getting stronger. She hugged his arm, resting her head against it. I knew you didn't do bad things. Ethan stopped walking, kneeling to look her in the eyes. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to doubt that again. From a distance, Grace watched them. Camera in hand, documenting the moment. When Ethan looked her way, she smiled through the emotion brimming in her eyes. You made it, she said softly as he approached. Because of you, he replied. Because of the truth, she corrected. You just never stopped fighting for it. He looked out across the park, where sunlight filtered through the trees. And for the first time in years, he felt peace. Not the kind found in silence, but the kind born from surviving the storm. But even peace had its shadows. Far away, in a coastal villa hidden behind layers of false passports and offshore names, Damien Core sat before a wall of news screens. Every channel carried Ethan's testimony. Every network painted him as the villain, the betrayer, the ghost exposed at last. Core watched without emotion, then turned the screens off one by one. He poured himself a drink, the ice clinking softly in the glass. On the table beside him lay a new passport, a new identity, and a small device labeled Strand Directive Override. He smiled to himself. You can't kill what built the war, he murmured. You just feed it to the next man. But outside his window, across the sea, the sun was rising, bright and merciless. And somewhere in that light, a soul